Welcome back. We've spent a lot of time learning about Western civilization and how it grew into such a dominant power structure. We should probably shift our focus now to how all of that power would eventually lead to the bloodiest century in recorded history. That would be known as the 20th century. To tell the story of the 20th century, historians generally begin with the Great War, also known as World War I. At the time, it wasn't known as World War I because they had no idea there would be a World War II. To wrap our minds around how all this happened, maybe we should discuss the causes of the war to end all wars, which actually didn't end any, but in fact made things even worse. How did all this happen, you're wondering? Well, not by the assassination of an insignificant member of the Habsburg Empire, like had been suggested for decades. This was merely the match that lit the fire, which spread out of control. Today, we're not merely learning what happened, but actually breaking down the main, M.A.I.N, causes of World War I. All right. It might be best to recap a couple events from the 19th century before we go diving into the war itself. Now, following the Napoleonic era, European powers soon began their own pursuit of national identity. The various German-speaking kingdoms, like Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Saxony, and most notably Prussia, all recognized their power was somewhat limited and they were vulnerable to attack from larger entities, places like Austria-Hungary, France, and even Russia. Eventually, this guy, Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian military general, was seeking the unification of all German-speaking states. Meanwhile, France saw this as a threat and ultimately declared war on Prussia. This turned out to be a not-so-good idea. Prussian military strategy and leadership models were the best in the world. Many examples are still followed to this day, including the U.S. Army uses Prussian hierarchy and leadership models. The Prussians dominated France and quickly marched on Paris. It might be important to note, however, the French were facing their own vulnerability as Marxist rebels undermined their own French solidarity, making it much easier for the Prussians to decisively win. It's kind of hard to fight an enemy when you're fighting within your own country. This also convinced the other German kingdoms to unify together under King Frederick Wilhelm I and become the nation of Germany. Bismarck, meanwhile, would be named Chancellor of the new German nation. Basically, he runs the government, or the Kaiser, Wilhelm. The newly formed German Imperial Germany claimed the area of Alsace-Lorraine as a German territory. You need to write that down, Alsace-Lorraine. It really wasn't far-stretched, as they already spoke German and ate German foods and followed most other German cultural norms. The new German nation quickly became recognized as the ultimate military power in Europe, rivaling the British, who mostly relied upon a huge navy. However, the French were not too happy about surrendering Lorraine. You might want to write that down again, Alsace-Lorraine. It will really become quite a big deal later on. By 1888, Wilhelm passed, and the new German emperor was his son Kaiser, meaning Caesar or emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. I've mentioned previously that for many years, immediately following the war to end all wars, that's a funny one, it was presumed that a warrior-like culture in Germany was the primary cause of World War I. A century later, historians have clearly identified some primary causes, and that no single nation or event caused the Great War, but rather a series of conditions which created a not-so-perfect storm. This is social studies. We're going to talk a lot about isms. When describing the causes of World War I, we use the acronym M.A.I.N. And the M stands for militarism. Militarism is the belief or desire of a government that a nation should maintain a strong military, capable and prepared to use it aggressively to defend or promote any national interest. Let's look back, though. Traditionally, prior to the Napoleonic era in the early 19th century, armies were only built up during times of war. Soldiers and sailors were conscripted and trained and deployed directly while reserve officers were recalled to serve. Professional soldiering was not the norm. Well, at least it hadn't been since the fall of the Roman Empire. But this man, right here, Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian field marshal and founder of military strategy and tactics, defined the standing army principle as the need for a large defensive army as a deterrent to war. Professional soldiering also became a way for those of non-noble birth to rise in social status. Following the Industrial Revolution, Britain relied heavily on a large naval fleet and standing army to maintain its colonial interests. But soon Russia also followed, which led to a war in Crimea with the British and the French. Austria-Hungary, and of course the Germans followed in an effort to keep up with their neighbors. Now that the Industrial Revolution and advanced military technology, it became common for European nations to compete in arms races. Basically, to build the most powerful military force to deter or prevent others from attacking. This actually created a sense of paranoia, and each country continued to build larger and larger land and naval forces, which eventually led them to make secret alliances. From 1880 until 1914, a tangled web of secret alliances turned Europe into a potential powder keg. Now, a military alliance is an agreement or a contract between nations concerning national security. When both contracting parties agree to mutual protection and support in case of an attack. In other words, if you attack my friend, it's the same as attacking me. You might have heard the ancient Arabian proverb, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Now, this may seem like a way to prevent conflict, and probably would be if well publicized. However, prior to 1914, these pacts or treaties were more often made in secret. Let's try to break down these agreements. After all, there's a pretty good chance you'll see them again. First, 1882, the Triple Alliance. Write that down. Germany, under Bismarck. Remember him? Yeah, well, Bismarck strikes a deal with his German-speaking neighbors, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also known as the Habsburg Empire. Oh, and the Italians to the south. Now, these Central European powers all had similar strategic interests. The French were still upset with Germany over the Franco-Prussian War and that Alsace-Lorraine business, and Russia threatened the Austrian interests in the Balkans. Fast forward to 1907. France, Great Britain, and Russia together form the Triple Entente. This was preceded by a treaty between Britain and France ending centuries of disagreements, and a pact between Britain and Russia to not compete in Asia. That was following the Russian defeat by Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. I know. What a tangled web of politics. Just remember this. Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, and Italy. Write it down. It's on every test. Triple Entente, France, Britain, and Russia. Hopefully, by now, you're starting to understand why reading a map and knowing geography might come in handy. Next, we should quickly discuss imperialism. Imperialism is often confused with colonialism. I know, it's a lot of isms. Where colonialism was specifically intended for monetary gain following the Industrial Revolution. Imperialism, on the other hand, is more of a strategic philosophy by governments to grab more land, not only for resources, but also to build military power and security. When we think of empires, we usually think of Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, all of which sought to control major territories in both Europe and Asia. If we think back to previous units, we also recognize competition for resources in Africa, but more specifically strategic interests in the Middle East. The Middle East was predominantly controlled by the Ottoman Empire, centered in Turkey. By 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm entered into an agreement with the Turks, not only for oil, but to control access to the Black Sea through the Dardanelles Straits. This essentially would prevent Russia from having a functional warm water port for its navy. If its ships can't get to the Mediterranean, the ports do them no good. Meanwhile, the British controlled Palestine and Egypt, giving them complete access and control of the Suez Canal and a shortcut for naval trade in the East. Imperialism, gaining territory under a central power through alliance, conquest over smaller nations. This will be really important as we try to understand the Austro-Hungarian Empire under the Habsburg monarchy and their central influence on the start of the Great War. Finally, we reach the last philosophical cause to the war to end all wars: nationalism. Nationalism, which can be confused with patriotism, is also known as identifying with one's own nation and support for your own interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment or of the interests of other nations. So in other words, self-protection. Following the defeat of Napoleon and the rejection of imperial rule, many independent nations were formed from their former kingdoms based on common needs. Nationalism, in and of itself, is not necessarily a bad thing. As countries seek their independent identity, free from the larger empires allowing them to self-govern under their own flag, language, and other unifying cultural norms. Now, this was particularly noticeable in the Balkans, which were partially occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Serbia, in particular, was not willing to join the Habsburg rule like its neighbors in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Much of the Balkan territory was ruled for a time by the Ottomans, who, by the way, were also enemies with Russia. The Serbs developed a secret alliance with Russia in hopes of keeping its independence from Austria. I know this is all confusing. Think of it this way. When nationalism is combined with militarism and alliances, it's like fuel for a fire, just waiting for a spark to light the inferno. By 1914, all of these conditions combined for the perfect volatility to expand quickly into a global conflict where millions would lose their lives. Instead of a smaller conflict between two nations, every major power would be engulfed in the flames of global war. The match to light the flame would be an assassination of the heir to the Habsburg Empire. Dateline, June 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were touring the city of Sarajevo, Bosnia, which was annexed by Austria-Hungary 6 years earlier. At the same time, a Serbian terrorist, Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Black Hand Slavic nationalist group, was plotting to instigate conflict. Ferdinand's motorcade literally took a wrong turn and ran right into Princip, who shot the Archduke and Duchess. Assassination and tragedy was not exactly new to the Habsburgs. Anarchists had been assassinating family members for over 20 years. It was alleged that the Serbs actually warned Austria that this would happen. Meanwhile, Franz Ferdinand was expected to inherit the empire from his uncle Franz Joseph. This obviously wasn't going to happen. This incident would provoke Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. And then all the homies jumped in. Russia supports Serbia. Germany warns Russia to back off. France mobilizes its army toward the German border. Italy, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all declare neutrality. Germany marches on Luxembourg. It declares war on France. Oh, and the Germans sign a pact with the Ottoman Turks. Meanwhile, Belgium tells Germany, no way you can use our territory to attack France, so Germany invades Belgium, which ticks off Great Britain, who declares war on Germany, while the USA and Switzerland sit on the sidelines and watch how it plays out. Later, the Italians turn on their allies and join forces with the French. Austria declares war on Russia. Serbia declares war on Germany. And even the tiny country of Montenegro declares war on Austria. Spain says, I'm staying out of this mess. The French and British also declare war on Austria. Even Japan declares war on Germany and Austria. But it's a little too far away to do much. All this in less than 45 days. The Great War has begun. All right. I think we've pretty much established now that there was no singular cause or event that created the war to end all wars. So let's put it all together, shall we? Think of World War I. as a giant fire. It takes lots of fuel to make a large fire. Militarism. Add a little bit of gasoline. Alliances. We need oxygen to help it grow. Nationalism. And of course, kindling to help it build. Imperialism. And finally, a spark or match to ignite it all. Assassination. These are the main causes of the Great War, which collectively scorched the earth in a way never seen before, and as many had hoped would never happen again.